Hi again, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Stronger Together podcast with ACSI. I'm Josh Warden. We're looking forward to this June in the Rooted Educator Worldview Summit in Colorado Springs. ACSI will host that in conjunction with the Colson Center. The last couple of years, the first two annual summits were a great opportunity for educators to ground themselves in a biblical worldview and learn how to translate that more and more into the classroom. We're excited to have Dr. Sean McDowell, who you may know that name as a speaker, apologetics, his own, work in the Christian worldview sphere. He's spoken at some other ACSI events before, including one of the Rooted Educator Worldview Summits. He'll be there again in Colorado Springs this year. I had the opportunity recently to sit down with Dr. McDowell and talk through some things both related to what we'll expect at the summit this year in Colorado Springs, but also just talking about Christian education. After all, you may have heard his work on apologetics or a number of different things related to theology, but specifically for Christian education, a good opportunity just to pick his brain a little bit. So here's a snippet of that conversation with Dr. Sean McDowell. This is not your first Rooted nor your first ACSI event, so how excited are you for this and just the value for educators being at an event like this one especially in Colorado Springs?
Well, you're right. This is not my first event with ACSI, Josh, and Lord willing, it won't be my last. I value my partnership with ACSI on a lot of levels, from the student events that I get a chance to speak at, from mentoring with Bible teachers, to speaking at Rooted. And where Rooted really fits in is, I'd say, two things. One is it's a time of equipping, a time of being challenged, a time of hearing just from people who love students and understand what's going on in culture, just to get equipped to move forward. Because the moment as teachers and educators, we get comfortable in what we're doing, then we are no longer innovating, we're no longer as effective as we could be, and we're falling behind. This surprises people because I'm 5'9", 150, but I played college basketball, and my coach is the fourth all-time winningest basketball coach in men's college basketball history. He's like a living legend. And he'd always say, either you're getting better or you are getting worse. You're never staying the same. And so it's sometimes uncomfortable with new technology and with new issues. It's just easy to sit back and do what we've always done. Way too much is at stake with this generation to do that. I mean, I'm not one to overstate things, but literally eternity is at stake with our kids and what they believe about God. And so Root is a chance to come and be challenged and to grow and to be more effective as educators. Second, it's just fun to be around other Christian teachers. And whatever your field is, or if you coach, you'll find other people there who are doing the same things. And one of the big takeaways I hear is people say things like, you know what, I don't feel alone anymore. Somebody understands me. There's people who get me. And you just realize you're part of something bigger than yourself. And that's just encouraging. So from growing and learning, being a better educator, and then second, just being encouraged, that in itself is incredible value from Rooted.
That's great. Now, you've not only been in ACSI circumstances where you're helping the educators who then help their students. You've also been firsthand with the students, the apologetics conferences where it's largely high school students right there in person. What have those experiences been like to actually see not that this is the only time you interact with students, obviously, but for those apologetics conferences in particular, just to see those students learning through and wrestling with some big topics and any interactions you've had, what have those been like for you?
Well, I taught in the classroom full-time and part-time for 21 years, high school Bible. And sometimes I like to consider it a healthy envy of like coaches and others who had kids outside of the classroom. Sometimes when students come into the classroom, they just put on their educator hat and they just kind of move into that mode. And I would try to like simulate experiences and challenge their thinking and mix things up. And obviously believe in the classroom, it's vital and life change can take place there. But that's why I would love taking students on apologetics mission trips. We do our retreat and the student apologetic conferences. It's out of their normal routine. They're not sitting in their normal seats. They're in a different environment. And honestly, they're probably hearing some of the same things that we're teaching in the classroom and they hear from their parents probably. But sometimes it's just a different setting. Sometimes it's just a different story that helps connect those dots and reinforce what we're doing in the classroom. So I wouldn't encourage educators to say, well, if I'm going to bring my students and one, lecture from Sean McDowell will change their life. That's just probably not going to happen. I mean, I've heard some anecdotes like that, but I would even I'd have parents say to me sometimes, like, I'm putting my kid in your class, so you'll teach him how to think biblically. And I was like, well, I can help what you're doing, but I alone can't do this if the parents are on board. I'd say, but I'm here to support you if I can. That's what these conferences are about, is we just want to support and motivate and inspire. And just like, it says Jesus was a prophet's not welcome in his home country. I'd have students who I was just their Bible teacher. And then when somebody else would come in and say it, they'd be like, now it makes sense. I'm like, really? I've said that to you a lot of times. But it's like, thank God there's other voices speaking in. That's what these student conferences are. And I'll tell you, I hear all the time that students are not interested in apologetics and they're just focused on feelings. My experience is the vast majority of students want to make sense of the world. They're asking big questions. And if you take them seriously, present in an interesting way, the vast majority of them come alive at these events.
And this question maybe is kind of in that line because it'll be a question I'm sure anyone listening to this will have thought about before, whether they're a spiritual life director, Bible teacher, head of school, but how to make organic conversations in classrooms about difficult questions. I'm sure they've thought about it, but maybe you can add on or just complement some of their thinking. What are some ways to create organic conversations, just help those discussions foster them organically?
Well, the first just starts with the culture that we create. So, are we threatened by questions that are raised that maybe students are believing things that we're not comfortable with or we think are wrong? Do we invite questions? And are we okay when students say, I'm not sure that I'm convinced? Well, if I have a student say, I'm not sure I'm convinced by this, I wouldn't jump in and say, hey, here's 3 reasons why you should be convinced. What's wrong with you? That actually shuts down conversation. I would say, tell me about that. What do you not find convincing? What perspective do you find more convincing than this? What would convince you? Is the issue intellectual here, or is something else going on that's a part of this conversation? Tell me about it. And so, if we want students to ask real questions, we have to kind of create an environment where questions are welcome and questions are okay. And some of what that does is I used to tell myself, I got to give kids all the right answers. Like with fear, they believe something, or they leave with some doubt in their minds. And I realized even for me admitting, you know what, I'm not sure about the answer to that. I have questions. I don't really know. Let me get back to you on that one. Or come in at lunch and talk to me about that. Let me do a little research and look some things up. It actually communicates to the students that I can follow Jesus, I can have faith, and I can have questions. So, questions and doubts are not the opposite of faith. Unbelief is. So, I think it really starts by the culture we create. Second is I would just say, so create a right culture. Second, respond, ask more questions than you give answers. Questions, questions, questions. I say this all the time, but in the Gospels and Acts, we have 340 questions of Jesus. By the way, he answered, I think, about 8. We have 262 questions in the letters of Paul. So ask questions and listen. And the last thing is, I had it years ago. It was actually at an ACSI event when they used to do those huge events at like the Anaheim Convention Center. This one Bible teacher said he would actually put a question box in the back of his classroom. And he said students could ask anything. And he said, as long as we wrestle with this and go to scripture, you can literally ask anything. And I did that for years. And sometimes it was like the last half of the class Friday, we'd go to the question box and students looked forward to it and they loved it. But that's a practical way. Just give them little note cards. They put it in there and then you pull them out. Instead of answering myself, I'd say, okay, here's a question. I have some thoughts on this, but how would you answer this? What do you think the Bible says about this? And by the way, if students say, I don't know, here's what you say back. You say, if you did know, what would you say? And I'm not kidding. Half the time they will then give an answer.
That's great. Well, let's close with kind of a thought from your experience. When you interact with, let's say, college students, whether it be at Biola in California or any college students you may interact with, what sort of things do you see where, maybe they've gone to a Christian school and because of they had great educators, they then had whatever quality you may see because, I guess I'm trying to say the portrait of a graduate because of a great education, you saw them being better equipped and you noticed it in this particular area, whatever it may be. And how could the Rooted Educator Worldview Summit then prepare educators to then prepare the students to get to that level, if that sort of makes sense? Any qualities you've seen on the back end after they've finished their time, maybe at a K through 12 Christian school, that you've been able to see and be encouraged by from their background?
Yeah, let me answer this a little differently than I think you may be asking, but I hope this is helpful. Here's the qualities I see when kids don't end up following the faith. I often hear of a bad experience they have of being judged, not being loved, legalistic, simplistic answers, straw man positions of other views. And so they get out and it's like, oh my goodness, I was told that the evidence for the Bible was just really clear and clean and obvious, and there was no doubt. And this really smart person is talking about textual variants. We got to steel man positions on the flip side. So if the narratives that I hear from students who have hypocrisy, they see hypocrisy, they feel it's legalistic, and positions are strawmanned. On the flip side, we got to steel man positions. We shouldn't be afraid to have our students read compelling Marxist arguments or postmodern arguments or criticisms of the Bible, because Christianity is true. We shouldn't be threatened by that. We need to avoid being legalistic and make sure that the hills we die on are biblical hills, and just make sure we're not being hypocrites in terms of how we live our lives. So I find when students come from a healthy environment where they're loved and they're cared for, they're taught to think biblically, and the other side is steel manned. The majority, especially if they have the support from the parents, and the reality is, Josh, hands down, parents have the biggest influence on kids, period. It's not coaches, it's not teachers, it's not a youth pastor. Yesterday in my class at Biola, I asked students, I said, who are the most influential, think of the most influential person in your life. And some of you share a story. Kid raised hand and goes, my mom and dad. And about 30 students, I said, how many of you would agree? I think 80 or 90% of their hands went up. That's a statistical fact. So we got to do what we can to support the relationship with what the parents are doing. But realize it doesn't all come down to teachers in the classroom. And I'm saying that to free people. I had a student contact me on Instagram, and he was in my class 20 some years ago. He goes, I'm an atheist now. Okay, I've had a couple students reach out to me and say that. And if that happens to me, I'm pretty sure that's going to happen to all of us. So I listen, we grab coffee, try to do better at whatever I'm teaching. But that's love kids, steel man positions, make sure we are not being hypocritical, and then we can trust God with the results.
That's a good perspective. Well, Sean, I'm looking forward to being there in Colorado Springs. Thanks for all the things you've done with ACSI, and hope to have a great time there at the Rooted Educator Worldview Summit. Thanks for your time today.
You bet. We'll see you and all your listeners there.
Well, again, you can sign up for the Rooted Educator Worldview Summit at acsi.org/rooted. Thanks so much for tuning in to the Stronger Together podcast. We appreciate your service in Christian education. We appreciate you following along on this podcast. Hope you can tune in to any and all of the 4 podcasts that ACSI produces. I'm Josh Warden. For everyone at ACSI, thanks so much for tuning in.